Hi, everyone. Professor Philip Travis, and it is week 6 here at EOU for History 112. This week, it's a little bit of a lighter week in the sense that 2 weeks ago we had our exam. Last week we had our first paper option. So this week we have a quiz this week, but we only have one chapter reading, and we have a collection of two primary sources that I want us to read this week. So a little bit less reading and a little bit lighter week compared to the previous 2 weeks. Our reading for this week, we are looking at the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, though, we're really beginning in the 18th century, stringing from the 19th century well into the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, there are places in the developing world today that are going through their industrial revolution right now. We're going to be speaking particularly about the industrial revolution experienced by Western Europe and America during the period of the 19th century, particularly. And for this week, I want us to read chapter 26 from our textbook on this subject. I also want us to read two short primary source documents from the late 1800s. These documents relate to a debate, a social debate over something which you might call the social Darwinist debate, a debate between social Darwinists and progressive reformists. Before we would have really called them progressives, but progressive reformists of the late 1800s. And our two writers are William Graham Sumner, the social Darwinist of the age, and also Henry George, the reformer of the late 1800s Industrial Revolution in Western Europe and the United States, particularly. There's a quiz this week, and the quiz is on the reading, and the quiz questions will be emphasizing not only the chapter reading, but also the primary source reading for the week. I'll get the quiz open to you by Tuesday, and make sure when you're reading, use a highlighter. Highlight your textbook, unless you rented it, of course. But highlight your textbook. If you can, print off those PDFs. They're in modules of the primary sources, and highlight those to help you when you take this quiz. I will give you probably 25 to 30 minutes on the quiz. So it comes from chapter 26, and also our reading from the social debate surrounding social Darwinism and reform during the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe and the United States. And the reason this debate existed, and what you're looking at, this image you're looking at here, is a artistic depiction of coal mines and blast furnaces for iron production in the area around Birmingham in England. The Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain. It started first in the textile industry. Some of the reasons for this, it started in the later 1700s, but really took off in the early 1800s. And part of the reasons for this was Great Britain was a small island. It had, for the time, pretty prevalent resources of iron ore and coal. And it was smaller, so as railroads started to develop, you could also interconnect the area more easily with railroads. And by the time of the early 1800s, Great Britain was, of course, cut off from the Napoleonic Wars that ravaged the continent of Europe as Napoleon's armies conquered from Spain all the way into Eastern Europe and all the way into Russia. Of course, we know Napoleon ultimately failed in Russia in 1812 in a devastating defeat, of course, that predated his ultimate defeat at Waterloo. But the Napoleonic Wars really ravaged the continent of Europe and, of course, slowed down the process of the development of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Great Britain, too, this is important to remember, Great Britain, too, coming out of the Enlightenment, Great Britain being a parliamentary monarchy, unlike your absolute monarchies, like we studied the week prior with the French Revolution, the American Revolution, but with the French Revolution, the absolute monarchies of Louis XIV, Great Britain had developed as a parliamentary monarchy. At the end of the 1600s, the English Bill of Rights had led to gains in terms of the rights of individuals and the individual rights to have a voice, some voice in the government, and also Enlightenment philosophies from folks like John Locke and Adam Smith, which really promoted um, private investment, uh, private lending industries and banking industries, and also a more limited government when it came to intervening in those affairs. And so when it came to building factories on a large scale, right, building factories are very expensive. And so if you're going to build factories, there needs to be credit and lending industries or lending services in place. And because of Enlightenment ideas and the nature of the British parliamentary monarchy, in the United Kingdom, you had earlier development of of corporations, of banking industries, and lending industries that made it possible for the development of factories. And so the ideas of Adam Smith, who of course wrote The Wealth of Nations, advocating for uh, more free market private capitalism, the ideas of John Locke, promoting limited parliamentary governments, these ideas had kind of begun to take hold in Great Britain and helped to give rise to the types of institutions that really made the Industrial Revolution possible, the banking and credit and lending institutions. The Industrial Revolution was really, really significant too for humans and how people live. In some respects, on one side of it, the Industrial Revolution created um, greater lifespans. It improved the quality of life for many of people. It created ultimately faster modes of transportation, faster modes of communication. You were able to farm more crops at greater, so people were ultimately consuming better diets. So people's nutrition across the board generally went up. People tended to live longer. However, the scale of environmental destruction also went up massively. And for working class people, the situation in the Industrial Revolution was particularly dire now. People who had formerly had skilled jobs as blacksmiths or in the cottage industries making fabric, textiles, these people all lost their wages. Skilled jobs went by the wayside, just like in the 21st century when we face concerns over people's jobs with automation. The Industrial Revolution of some 200 plus years ago uh, damaged and threatened the livelihoods of many working class people as well, as machines and automation, I mean, relative automation, took jobs like textile jobs, the weaving of fabric, or the creating of fabric, I should say. Um, Work on railroads, ultimately a product of the Industrial Revolution, things like the Westinghouse air brake, put all of the brakemen who used to work on the trains out of work. Blacksmiths who used to make, you know, tools and locks of metal and things like this by hand were now out of work and replaced by large industrial uh, factories and manufacturing methods that anybody can be trained to do, and conditions that were very, very difficult, very dangerous, and often very dirty. And so, for working class people, particularly in industries like the one you see pictured here, it resulted in a very, very hard existence. Coal miners, for example, lived very short lives, oftentimes, as did people working in the iron industry. Unionization was very difficult because these types of industries were unskilled industries. And so, for labor to gain better wages, it was a very uphill battle. And there were often violent labor disputes between factory owners, between private police, and even governments and workers attempting to unionize to gain better wages. In addition to the difficulty of working conditions, which of course saw huge inequities across gender lines as well. Women were always paid far less than men. In addition, women were encouraged to be domestic. Women were encouraged, if they didn't have to work, women should, if they were middle class, if you will, should stay at home, should seek to be homemakers rather than become engaged in the public sector public economic sector. And so the Industrial Revolution also drove the gender gap apart at this time. And we saw, of course, for those working class women that worked in the textile industries in the first half of the 1800s, particularly, huge inequities in wages, which of course persisted for years and years and years, in some cases all the way up to present. In the Industrial Revolution, we saw child labor as well, which was a huge, huge area that required reform that women advocated for. Because women were some of the foremost progressives advocating for improved labor conditions and better wages, not just for women, but for other individuals as well, and also the elimination of child labor. So the Industrial Revolution, and in addition, of course, you have environmental destruction. The Industrial Revolution is the time period where we really see the production of fossil fuels and carbon emissions into the atmosphere, which, of course, in the 21st century has become a great concern for humanity. We see that graph, if you will, of those emissions chart up here in the 1800s as fossil fuels begin to be produced and burned on a very high scale. And of course, low level air pollution became an issue as well. So the factoid, and I'm making this a little bit long here, so um, um, so I'm going to I'll give you 2 bonus points for this week's factoid because I've made this a little long. This week, in addition to our reading, also there's a little short film I would like everybody to watch, and this is in the discussion forum. It's about 20 minutes, and it's going to really help you go over some of the key items associated with the Industrial Revolution. But the factoid for this week is the word Luddites, or the group known as the Luddites. Today, if you were to call somebody a Luddite, it would be a sort of academic way of telling someone that they're afraid of technology. And where that term comes from is from a revolt, effectively, that occurred, I think it started in Nottingham, England, in which textile workers had all had their livelihood destroyed by the creation of textile factories. Textile factories, which were large, machine-run factories, workers were working in dangerous conditions, conditions that damaged their lungs because of the fibers, conditions that were loud and crowded. They had to work long hours and long days of the week, and their pay was far less than the manufacture of cloth would have been during the cottage industry, during the pre-industrial period. Well, the Luddites were a group that rose up in revolt against the textile machines, and particularly the form of revolt that the Luddites took was actions to destroy and sabotage the machines that destroyed their livelihood. And this occurred in the second decade of the 1800s. Of course, the Luddites failed, and the progress of technology ultimately meant that the way things were made would continue to change regardless of the resistance of the Luddites. And this is similar to the concerns today over automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence. It's very similar as people face concerns over their livelihoods and their jobs. So the factoid for this week is the Luddites, a revolt in England in the 1800s, the second decade of the 1800s, in which a group of individuals known as the Luddites revolted, destroying textile machines, destroying factories, out of a futile hope that they might stop the progression of the Industrial Revolution in this area, which was destroying their livelihood. Sorry, this is a little bit long. We historians can be a little long-winded. I'll see you in the discussion forum this week. 2 bonus points. Email me that factoid no later than Wednesday by midnight. Get your 2 bonus points added to a test score at the end of the term. I'll see you in the discussion forum. Let's have a great week.